Every time. Okay, welcome everyone to the Hot Lectures discussion for 2022-3. Our speaker this year, as you all know, is RJ Wallace, who has been talking to us about crossing moral lines and about resentment and social friction and about the politics of grievance. The point of this session is for people to be able to engage in a longer term, more, or longer form, more probing discussion with Jay about the provocative ideas that he raised during his two talks. We'll start out by
Austin described it as the final public oral part of it.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Something like that.
Yeah.
The final public oral, really.
Yeah.
Maybe in light of that characterization, we should do the courtesy of inviting Professor Wallace to frame the discussion with any remarks he might want to make first, and then I'll open it up to questions and discussion. So anything you want to say?
I feel like I've been yammering on enough, over the last couple of days. So, I'm happy to frame it if you want, but I don't think, I'm not sure it's really necessary.
Okay.
And I have nothing in particular I'm keen to say. I'd be more interested in just seeing what's your questions and doubts and probing decisive counterexamples and such.
So the floor is open, and I will. I'm already on the list, but I'll move myself down. Let other people go first. Yeah, Austin.
Yeah, thank you again for being here. I have what might be just a small clarificatory remark about something you said at the end of the second lecture, where you talk about you're like wrapping up at the very end, and you talk about how these reactive attitudes play less of like a forward-looking role, perhaps, so much as a backward-looking role, doing the work of repair amongst the parties. And it seemed a little bit intentional with other stuff you've said at other point in your works about how these reactive attitudes flesh out the concept of these deontological concepts, and especially how they play a sort of peremptory role or deliberations and all of that. And so maybe there's no tension there, but I was like surprised to hear you say that about how it doesn't play the forward-looking role as any central role in yours.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair that's a fair point. And I was, short-winded on this issue, of course, at the end of a long lecture, so there's more to be said about it. With the peremptory deliberative role of obligations, I actually don't think my conception of that is that it's connected in the first instance to our sense that violating the norms is going to attract reactive blame on the part of other people. In the recent book, I suggest that there are these two normatively distinctive features of modern interpersonal morality: its status as a set of norms that function as presumptive constraints in the perspective of agency, and its interpersonal function as a basis for accountability relations. But I wasn't thinking that the two are connected in quite that direct way, so that our sense of the peremptory force of moral obligations is just derivative directly from our desire to avoid opprobrium on the part of other people. Having said that, however, I think I've said elsewhere, I have a paper on hypocrisy, for instance, and that paper, I think, does refer to reactive blame as a kind of informal system of social pressures that function to help incentivize compliance with moral requirements and keep people on the right side of the moral lines. And so, and I think I stand by that as kind of a secondary role that that reactive blame or function that it might fulfill. right? It's like a backup. It's maybe there's an analog here just to, criminal sanctions in the law, there are a lot of, there are independent moral reasons for not killing and raping and assaulting and defrauding people, right? And we kind of hope that they're gonna not do those things for the right reasons. But we also attach sanctions to violations of those norms that kind of reinforce, that might be a kind of backup system of compliance and signal that it's important for people to stay on the right side of these lines. And that's kind of a forward-looking function. And so, I'm okay with the idea, and I think it's not too embarrassing to think that the accountability relations might have a kind of informal parallel function to play in a moral system which is not the role of supplanting the moral reasons, but just kind of reinforcing them in some ways. But I guess what I at the end of the third lecture, I was kind of focusing on as I said at one point, reactive blame is a device of partial compliance theory somehow. People are defecting from moral norms, and then we respond with blame to those infractions. And I'm, the whole. Oh wow! I always like to stand for branded water. Thanks, Phil. Yeah,
like Berkeley water.
much higher quality water. Yeah. So I mean, and then there was this larger theme that the social frictions that are connected to reactive blame, are sources of social power, right? And they function in that way by kind of being aversive presence or facts in our interpersonal relations in some ways, and they are kind of thinking about that dimension of it, to mobilize this power by blaming and expressing and acceding to one's reactive blame. One's applying pressure in some sense of a certain kind to other people that is creating reasons for them. And the initial question is, what those look like reasons of the wrong kind. I just was kind of thinking about what role do they play really in the primary context where you're actually blaming a target agent. And I'm just thinking in that context, they are creating new reasons, but they're not reasons for complying with norms in the first place in that context, because the relevant norms have already been flouted by the agent. It's a response to the flouting of a norm. And so my maybe too Pollyannish take on this is that the new reasons are functioning in a defensible way to incentivize the target agent to re-engage with the reasons they initially flouted, insofar as they're called on to acknowledge the wrongdoing and to remorsefully apologize and to begin a process of repair. And so they're trying to get the agent to go back to those reasons that were disregarded and acknowledge their significance, and that seemed like a kind of defensible backup function that reactive blame might play in this contrast, and it does, I think, contrast significantly with the Williams proleptic account, where which is super interesting, I think, and I think if you accept his pessimism about whether there are reasons for anyone to care about, the morality system in the first place, then I think there's a respectable kind of, but better to give people bad reasons for complying than no reasons at all. So, but I'm not as much of a pessimist about that. Yeah. I don't know. Does that speak to some of that?
It does speak to a lot of it. That's really helpful. I don't know if there's a chance to follow up or.
Always a chance to follow up.
So, I guess the connected question is about when you talk about bad reasons or
Yeah.
reasons of the wrong kind. I just want to make sure I'm hearing that.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah.
Here,
Right.
because I at first heard register like the wrong kinds of reasons that people talk about.
Yeah.
Or like belief or
Right.
desire, what have you. And then, but you've also been like pushing between that
Yeah.
and bad reasons. So
Yeah.
can you say more about that? And also like, are they just as wrong or bad reasons in this sort of in the case where they play this reinforcing role? Can you say, well, maybe they're appropriate, but we have recalcitrant dangerous factors? Are they still as bad and as wrong in that case?
Yeah.
How does that-
Great, those are good questions, yeah. I mean, there's something misleading by appropriating the language of wrong kind of reasons, because that is suggesting that I'm talking about like reasons for action as opposed to reasons for attitudes. And that's not really what what's at issue are two different kinds of reasons for action, construed as reasons for complying with moral norms in the first place. Should you comply with them because, out of a concern for the claims of other people that they define, or out of recognition of the significance of other people's interests? I would say those are moral reasons or reasons of the right kind. Or should you comply with them because you don't want to be subject to the pressures of opprobrium that other people are going to bring down on you when you flout them? Those are also reasons for action, and they might incentivize you to stay on the right side of the lines, but I think they would be less attractive reasons. That was the contrast I was trying to draw. Now, so then the second question, and it's helpful that you put that in this term, in these terms. Are these, opprobrium sensitive reasons, or are they also bad reasons in the context of the exchange between the aggrieved party and the agent that I'm thinking of as the primal scene for reactive blame? And yeah, I guess this is helpful, but I guess what I'm trying to say there is that in this context, they aren't bad reasons, really. We're creating some pressures interpersonally by responding with resentment or reactive anger to what the agent did, right? And that's subversive in some way for the target. But in a context where you're bringing those pressures to bear to encourage the agent to acknowledge their disregard of the primary moral reasons for, respecting people in the first place, I think that's a constructive role for reasons of that kind to play. I mean, the agent we're talking about who's wronged you has already disregarded the primary moral reasons in the first place. Right? I mean, I guess this came up at one point in discussion yesterday. Was it? I think it was TJ who asked a question about, if you're dealing with an agent who's going to be responsive to your blame, and care about maintaining the relationship, why don't you just nicely point out to them that there are these moral reasons in the vicinity and invite them to respond to them. But I'm thinking in the characteristic kind of blame interaction, it's already clear that there are those reasons and the agent has flouted them. And, in that context, there might be a reasonable role to be played by mobilizing, their concern not to be the target of social opprobrium, to get them to go back to those reasons and reconsider.
But I thought that the role that those reasons play favoring repair is the role that they can play legitimately in all cases in which someone has been wrong. And that you shifted that to saying, like, in all cases, that's appropriate, it's more of a factual role. But right before that, you're considering, well, but what about like especially recalcitrant and dangerous actors? So you seem to be saying that in that case, it's appropriate for them to play this further role in a sort of applying pressure to people to deliberate based on those reasons. So I'm wondering, in that case, are they like equally bad or wrong kinds of reasons?
In the political case, I was
In the political,
yeah, I know, I don't think so. I think they're again, in that context, I think they're good reasons. Yeah. I think they're, but insofar as they're functioning in this backup role to encourage the recalcitrant political agents to finally, own up to the oppression that they've been sustaining and take it seriously. It's like, what other recourse do we have? We could keep trying nicely to point out to them, that it's not okay for all these people to be locked up in prison, not have access to healthcare and so on. But at some point, and be, murdered by the police. If nothing happens, I don't know, is that okay? There is an interesting question of whether that's really a different role from the interpersonal role that I then went on to discuss at the end. And maybe I have to go back and clarify that transition, because I think they're functioning in a similar role in both cases. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's all.
Okay, thanks a lot, Austin.
Oh, yeah, thanks, yeah. This may actually just be the same question as one of Austin's questions, but
Yeah.
I don't have all the pieces oriented the right way in my head, so maybe not. It's also about the wrong kind of reasons concern. And I thought what you had to say about this was more concessive to that concern than I was expecting. So in a way, the way I hear the stuff about the backstop is you're kind of saying like, yeah, the social pressure of our reactive blame practices, of course, is a different kind of consideration than a genuine moral reason.
Yeah.
But what are you going to do, right? We're supposed to, we're trying to be alive here. So we need something like that, which of course that's true. That's a great point. But I was kind of thinking, I'm gonna put this very crudely, and maybe you'll see what I want to get at. And it's like, we're already in this picture where the moral is understood in terms of, a kind of relational commerce between people. And the reactive blaming, at least the good case, right, the repair, is also that kind of thing. It's the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of anticipating you to say something like, the critics say these are different kinds of things, but they're the same kind of thing. You see, I'm very, broad brush, but you see what I mean?
Yeah, good. I think I'm sympathetic to what you're saying there, and that all sounded right to me. I mean, I'm a little, I don't know about relational congress. Maybe that sounds too interactive or something.
Yeah.
Because as we were discussing at lunch, I mean, I do think there are these kind of relational norms in place, even in context where there's no thick relationship that they should lean on in any way. But I like what you say about like the repair process is, I kind of characterize it in terms, and there's this sort of, I mean, it is kind of an interesting question how to think about repair in the context of these kind of cases, because there's no undoing the thing that was done. So what exactly is going on? It's a slightly elusive phenomenon, but I put it in terms of like being in a position to resume normal interactions on a basis of a shared commitment to the norms.
I think I can, this is very good. I think I can sharpen my.
Oh, okay, good. Well, yeah.
So like maybe, right, what a genuine moral reason is a reason to, want to relate to another person in the normative way.
Yeah.
Without specifying what that is. And a moral wrong is an impairment of that relation, right? So that it's out of the normative regime.
Yeah.
And then when repair is some kind of process, right, whereby you return it to the normative regime. And so if what I experience as aversive social pressure is the fact that the relationship is not in the normative regime, right, then in a sense, that's exactly the right kind of reason. Right, it's my distance from the correct thing that I am being hurt by.
That's good, I like that, my worry about it, and the way the reason I'm still inclined to be a little bit concessive to this worry. Is that, and I think this goes back to the TJ question again in some sense, but like, if there's the impairment, and that's already a bad thing. Right, but the person's not that's already there to be acknowledged and apologized for and responded to, but in the cases where blame enters into the picture, that hasn't happened, right? And so, I'm thinking that we have an agent who's not so incorrigible that you can't get them to kind of go back and acknowledge wrongdoing and re-engage with those reasons, but need some extra, something extra to kind of incentivize them. And I'm thinking, the pressure applied through interpersonal blame is a further source of reason independent from the reason that's constituted by the infraction itself, right? And that it's that, maybe in an ideal world, the agent would immediately acknowledge that they've acted. I mean, and many people do this, obviously, when it's becomes clear to them that they've crossed the line, as they keep putting it, they immediately acknowledge that and wrong and trying to make up for it in a proper preemptive apologies. So, but if you're thinking of a case where that hasn't happened, I'm thinking that the application of the pressure is bringing something additional into it, which goes beyond the initial, whatever the normative significance of the infraction itself is as an impairment, to kind of give them an additional reason in a way to, and this is the constructive part of it, to kind of go back and re-engage with that reason that they disregarded initially. Does that help?
Yeah.
Does that seem defensible? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm gonna draw attention to what I think are some pretty important contrasts between the way you think about resentment and also Scanlon and Darwall and nearly everybody else, and then the way Strawson, I think, actually thinks about it.
Great.
And not because I care about who gets to claim the mantle of Strawson, but because I like his view better. And it seems to me that when we take his view over to the political context, the nature of the problem at least changes, and I think maybe gets easier. So, so for all of you guys, but not for Strawson, resentment is a moral attitude, and moreover, an attitude that the content of which is deontic. It's about the felt sense of righteous aggrievement or something like that. And Strawson, at least as I read him, it's very important to him. Actually, it's very important to understanding how he's supposed to get leverage against the person he's calling the pessimist. That these are not moral attitudes at all. By his criterion of morality, which is also very different, which is much more human. It has to do, in a way, it's more like your notion of third-party blame. It's about what can we, when we kind of arrive at a more disinterested standpoint, still feel bad about. And so when he's talking about the occasions and targets of resentment, instead of talking about things like wronging and a righteous sense of agreement, he talks about being hurt. He talks about being offended. He talks about what is normal and natural to be hurt or offended by, other people's indifference, other people's bearing me ill will, without suggesting that I need to have any of these kind of highly moralized, highly damaging thoughts. And this seems just right to me as a matter of, I mean, there are lots of typical cases of resentment that are like this. You know, my girlfriend's ex resents me, not because he thinks that I wronged him, but just because I'm the new boyfriend, right? I mean, I'm fine. And in the familial context, there's all sorts of long simmering resentments, and I don't take it too personal in my family, but they're about people being hurt, but not necessarily that if you kind of unpacked the content of these thoughts, that they would commit people to the idea of anyone's having wronged one, much less wronged one in a moral sense, where that means something like our standing as equals in some basic moral relation is at stake. So it's a way, it's a much more ground level, intimate, and in some ways sentimental as opposed to rationalistic treatment of resentment. Okay.
Yeah.
So now carry this over to the political context. And I think, look, I'm a pretty committed liberal.
Yeah.
I take seriously the kind of Rawlsian
Mhm.
realistic pluralism is our lot. In fact, I kind of like it.
Yeah,
I would be kind of alarmed if people weren't offended by some of the things that I do. The art and the music and the comedy that I like offends their sensibilities. We're all pitted against one another in some sort of competitive
Mhm.
capitalistic enterprise, and
Mhm.
to some extent it's zero sum, and they feel themselves injured by my, status as a liberal coastal elite, whatever. I think what I want is not for them not to feel resentment toward me, not to have negative feelings. I don't need them to like me.
Yeah.
What I want is for them to be very vigilant about the move from what seemed to me totally normal, healthy forms of negative feeling
Mhm.
to thinking that they have a political claim against me or people
Yeah.
like it, which they may well have, but which it seems to me. And so in a way, I'm worried that both you and the people that you're worried about politically are guilty of something like the same error, which is reading into what is a totally normal and healthy form of social response to at least some people, sometimes fraught because in the context of ongoing relationships like families and
Yeah.
friendships, but sometimes at a distance and totally fine. They don't have to like me. I don't have to like them. You can regard their way of life as worthy of my resentment and vice versa. So am I missing something? It seems to me that's a better, more ethically appealing way of
Mhm.
thinking about
Yeah.
where the emotion shows up, and where the kind of pathologizing comes in is actually in the move to moralize it too quickly. So I don't know.
I'd like to hear more about that last part of it, but, yeah, no, that's all very suggestive. Let's start with Strawson. I mean, there's so much going on in that article, and there's so many different ways of reading it, and he himself brings in so many things. I think you're absolutely right that what I'm getting out of it, and maybe what some of these other people who sometimes refer to themselves as Strawsonians get out of it is a certain kind of tendentious reading of what's going on that's highlighting certain threads and kind of downplaying others. One thing that's really, if I were to think of myself as a faithful interpreter of Strawson, one thing that I'm not doing a very good job of is making sense of how capacious his understanding of the reactive attitudes is, right? He's got all kinds of, I was gonna say shit, but. No, he's got all kinds of stuff in there, right? And it's not just these moralized emotions, right? There's love, a certain kind of love, right?
Gratitude, hurt feelings, all this stuff.
Gratitude,
Yeah.
hurtful feelings, exactly. And for me, I get it, it gets reduced down to resentment, indignation, and guilt. And, because those are, and this goes together. The other thing you're picking up on clearly is that I've got this very deontic conception of what these emotions are about.
Can I just add that even in the case of guilt, I think he wants to distinguish between moralized guilt and other forms of religious guilt, other kinds of guilt that are not, right? So for him, the thing that makes it moral is something like, being felt from the disinterested ideal spectator's point of view or something like that. But I might feel guilty in a much more personal way that's nobody else's business, according to me.
Right. Possibly, yeah. I mean, there's a lot going on with guilt as well, and different sources of it. Anyway, I disavow any aspiration to be a faithful interpreter of Strawson, even though I call myself a Strawsonian. I'm drawing on one strand in his work that I think I can understand, but I realize there's a lot more going on, and what comes out of this is probably not something that Strawson would recognize as a representation of his view. And it goes together with that maybe the things I'm kind of downplaying are rich resources for bringing his framework to bear on like our political context that I don't have access to because I've moralized it so much. At the ground level. So I'm being kind of concessive here about some of this stuff. And in part because I just appreciate the richness of the article, and that there's a lot of different ways to be a Straussian and to make use of it. I mean, I think, there's still something Straussian about my position. There are reactive attitudes there, and to hold someone accountable is to be susceptible to the reactive attitudes, and that's characteristic of a certain way of. Now, here's where deonticity comes into it, but Strawson talks a lot about demands and expectations. And he says the making of the demand is the holding to, the proneness to the attitudes, right? And I read demands and expectations as pretty deontic things, and they seem kind of familiar to me from our interpersonal context too. We kind of expect things of each other, and we hold each other to demands or expectations. And I think I have a kind of grip on that as a core way of constituting, social life around accountability relations. It's kind of holding people to account in a way. And I think that's in Strawson, among other things. I don't quite, when you expand the reactive attitudes to include things like love and gratitude, it's hard to fit the demands or expectations into it. But he himself is bringing them. Yeah, when I wrote my first book, I counted how many times demands or expectations appeared in this article, and there were quite a number of occurrences, and they were connected pretty clearly to what he's calling the reactive attitudes. So, in my partial defense, I think I'm drawing on things there that are that have some basis in the text. I'd also note that he himself is, there's a pluralist moment where he notes, you remember that part where I'm sure, of course you do, but he admits that there are different vocabularies for talking about the things he's referring to, and there's a kind of more deontic Kantian vocabulary and the French vocabulary. Sentimentalist vocabulary, and suggests that there are,
Major bodies of that French and deontic.
But no, there's the moral censorship.
Yeah.
Which is the one that I think is probably closest to his heart. And so
Yeah.
So of course he's a big continent.
Yeah.
In his own right, but so anyway, that kind of suggests that he's open to the idea that there's no single vocabulary that captures these phenomena. There are different ways to theorize it and develop it philosophically, and that might lead Strawson, if he or his ghost were still around, to be okay with some of this misusing this text by developing it in this deontic way.
Can I follow up? Sure. So
I have a lot. We haven't, but no. Let's keep. This is helpful.
well, you may have been actually ready to reply to the other part, which I guess I'm more worried about. So
Okay,
I feel like if I grant
Yeah.
it's interpretively
Yeah.
open and
Yeah.
Somebody very clever once said to me that, this is just him working out his baggage of trying to reconcile his inner human and inner Kantian, and he
I
can
see.
do it and have some sympathy for
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
It's psychoanalytic reading of
Yeah.
a lot of his work, but what I really do
Yeah.
care about is you're giving us essentially a kind of ethical ideal of the attitude of resentment.
Yeah.
Embedded in a broader ethical ideal of human relationships as sort of regulated at bottom by these deontic notions. And I'm thinking about the contrast between that and one that puts that kind of material at a much higher level of intellectualization, articulation, and makes it more sparing in how it's deployed in our interpersonal commerce, especially politically. So
Good. No, I'd like to make sure I'm not entirely sure I understand where the differences are supposed to come into clear focus when it gets to the political application. So I hope we can talk about that a little bit more. But so my picture is one where there are these antagonisms or, forms of hostility that come to be partly constitutive of one's sense of one's identity, right? And that's their real psychic significance, right, is in this role. So they're bound up with their sense of identity in a way. But they're directed to targets in a way that's kind of, it's not about anything in the target fundamentally. It's just they're functioning as a way of, we need someone to hate, so that we can constitute ourselves as a group that's oriented against the other in a certain way. I think there is that kind of process, and I'm not alone in worrying that in modern liberal societies, certainly in the United States, the geographic sorting, the sorting by levels of educational attainment, which has the consequence that we don't interact with people in the other tribe that much, is going together with a process of kind of identity based or antagonism toward the members of the other group. But just to clarify my picture, that there's no morality in that at the ground level. My story is that the politics of grievance involves propagation of narratives that are moralized stories about the target, whose real meaning is that they make this antecedent orientation of antagonism intelligible to the subject. And if the person you're antecedently kind of opposed to is a coastal elitist snob who holds your values in contempt and thinks you're an idiot and would never deign to eat the food you eat and so on, they're kind of disrespecting you in some sense, and it sort of makes sense to be opposed to them, to be hostile to them. Your hostility gets transformed by this process into what the more reactive, what the kind of thing that I'm calling a reactive attitude, a kind of form of reactive blame that is about an imagined moral infraction, right? And it seemed to me an advantage of this story that it could explain why people have a propensity to latch onto these fantastic narratives that are often completely untethered from reality, about the members of the other tribe. And I think there's some symmetry to it. It's not just all in one direction from the Heartlanders toward the elitists in some way. So anyway, that's where the moral element was coming in my story. I'm not, it's not like I'm thinking that these antagonisms are at the bottom about a moral infraction. On the contrary, I'm saying that they're kind of prior to anything that we might do to each other and connected to processes of identity formation. And the narratives that turn them into reactive blame and anger, are driven by the psychic need to make sense of this antecedent sense of antagonism. Now, at the end of the day, I'm totally on board with you that it's okay to not like other people, and I think what we and just to live with that. I think what we need to, on my own kind of, this is pop sociology, and I'm not very good. I'm a philosopher, so, but it seems like what we need to do is to de-escalate these antagonisms and disentangle them from from core identity features, and so that we can live with them in some sense. And there are lots of cultural things that human communities have developed that play this role. I mean, our institutions are in some kind of made up rivalry about each other, right? But that's kind of cool. That's a way to domesticate our natural tendency to, you build school spirit by having a bonfire before the big game, right? And going and cheering when you beat Stanford. Vice versa. It's completely harmless. It's not really about anything, but it does foment, a certain kind of community around a kind of, I think sports are great for this. you know, anyone who's grown up in Boston knows about hating the Yankees. Is that about anything? Yeah, but no, it's just, you know, what part of what it is to be. Yeah, well, you know, I think you're taking it a little too seriously. It's like, it's, you know, it's just like.
But that.
Okay, yeah, but, you know, it's kind of playful, and we need more of that in our culture, and so that these antagonists and stuff come to seem quite so existential. Now, anyway, I think I'm just repeating my story, but I'm doing that in part because I'm really curious to hear what this story is missing that you think the more Humean reading of Strawson will help us to.
Well, so I guess what I was thinking, I mean, so in a way, I agree with you that if the question is a kind of armchair sociological explanatory question, like how is this
Yeah.
working socially?
Yeah.
That your analysis of how people are thinking about resentment might help us with that. But I take it there's also it's kind of an ethical question.
Yeah.
How to resent people, how to
Yeah.
interpret my own feelings,
Yeah,
and what does or doesn't
yeah,
follow from the fact that I feel a certain instinctively negative,
Yeah.
energizing sentiment towards somebody else.
Yeah.
And it seems to me it's on that question where I was thinking the Strawsonian answer, which says, look, resent without immediately exalting your own resentment into
Yeah.
some sense of righteous grievance is actually a useful thing to hand to
Mhm.
people on both sides of these political
Mhm.
bits of comment. So in a way, it could look more like the
Yeah.
sports rivalry. You say, look,
Yeah.
we don't all have to like each other.
Yeah.
But we do need to be very careful about thinking that the kind of natural dislike that comes from difference of opinion about all sorts of things about how to live
Yeah.
should turn into a sense of grievance that often comes along with a kind of entitlement to socially disqualify people, which comes along with various other,
Good.
you know, kind of moralized reactions in
Yeah.
training. It's not to say that nobody ever does anything immoral in politics. It's just to say that that's where it seems like the move from, I really don't like you and I resent you and I regard it as totally normal that I would in our circumstances to you've wronged me and moreover wronged me in a moral sense such that we now need to figure out whether my resentment is righteous or your action was righteous. Like we could just say, we're not in that space yet.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a fair amount of overlap between us on that
Yeah.
point. I mean, because in part, that's what I'm saying is the whole problem is that this antagonism gets moralized in a way, and you know, and in the politics of grievance that you know we're dealing with socially, it gets moralized in a way that you can't even constructively deal with. And so becomes so untethered from reality and seems obvious. And I totally agree. It needs to be de-escalated completely in that context. But I thought the first step might be to try to understand what might be behind it before we can get there. I think we're, you know, obviously we're going to residually disagree about things. I'm more of a fan of the morality system, and you're more of a skeptic about it, and that's okay. I don't have to hate you for that.
No line got crossed.
But I mean, that's part of the background disagreement here, that I do think there are, you know, that there's a kind of what Williams referred to as the morality system as a kind of idealized and problematic deformation of our moral notions or ethical instincts in some sense, is something I think has a defensible form. And that makes sense. And you know, it's constituted by a set of relational requirements that link us to each other and that are the framework for the situations where there's maybe some constructive role for a more deontic kind of reactive blame to figure interpersonally, but you know, but that's a controversial picture. Obviously, certainly Williams himself didn't agree with it. Probably Strawson didn't either. And to the extent that's the case, there, you know, I'm really just taking the ball and running with it, as one sometimes do, as well, to maybe feel different from the ones that are operating.
Rugby has been invented.
Rugby.
Thank you.
Armando is next.
Thank you. So,
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
as you can probably guess from my questions, I come from an Aristotelian perspective, which means since I'm not the Deontic, that's a French perspective. I'm an Aristotelian, it's okay, it happens. So from my French perspective, I do want to dislodge the wrong the subject, which I guess is in a similar vein, and that's what I have been trying to dislodge these last lectures. And I think I have an answer. So in our last conversation, right, so it's a distinguished professor, the postdoc. The postdoc feels that the distinguished professor hasn't published anything, very smart, but he's not using his intelligence. The postdoc actually doesn't believe that he deserves it either, right? So that way you get rid of the envy critique.
Yeah.
So I don't deserve it either, but you surely don't. Okay, and I said that's resentment. He was like, well, if it's resentment, and I say it's resentment without anybody being wrong. They said like, well, no, since we're both members of the same community, then the community is the one being wrong. And then that's why you're feeling the resentment. That was, if I recollect your answer.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so the reason.
I think that's an intelligible thought, you know.
Oh, no, I think it's a true emotion.
People who have, very scarce and desirable positions and talents might, if we belong to a community organized around shared
Yeah,
commitment to certain values, that they might owe it to everyone to make good use of the good fortune that they've.
oh,
Yeah.
I agree 100%. And I am just doing like, I think, who was it? Somebody called it what I like to do, moral botany. I'm just trying to distinguish.
Yeah.
So I agree that's an emotion. I just don't think that emotion is resentment. And I don't think that's the emotion that the postdoc is. And here are the two examples where I try to show
Yeah.
the other emotion that I think you're correct identifying, maybe it's indignation. And then the one resentment, the one I'm trying to emphasize. So in one case, imagine it's actually one of your peers. And let's say he also has a distinguished chair or she, right?
Yeah.
Like also a distinguished chair, so you're equals. And they realize that you're not doing your work, right? As you mentioned, you're wronging the society of which they're also part of a community, right?
Yeah.
I just don't think that will be indignation. Sorry, that won't be resentment. It will be indignation, it will be something else. It's just the emotion coming from your peer of you not doing your job, even if you're members of the community,
Yeah.
seems to be a different kind of emotion than the postdoc. And to emphasize that more, I don't know if you watched the movie Good Will Hunting. You did? Okay.
Well, I mean, ages ago, it was a lot of fun.
It's a very simple plot. I'm sure.
Yeah.
It's a memorable, great guy.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
You remember the scene where the mad professor starts shouting at Will of like, nobody can tell the difference between you and me, but I can. You don't know. So it's basically like, Will is like, I don't want to do this anymore. I just want to go back to be a janitor.
Yeah.
And then the professor is furious.
Yeah.
Because he's like, you're wasting your talent.
Yeah.
Right? And he said, like, nobody can tell the difference between you and me, but I can. And so I know that you have a greater talent than me.
Yeah.
So imagine that there's this, we're
Yeah.
going to the Will Hunting part, and then you're like, look, imagine that it was you before you became the distinguished professor.
Yeah.
And it's like all the wasted talent because you decided not to use your talent. Right? So it's the same situation, except without holding the professorship.
Yeah.
And in that case, that person is outside of the society. Let's say that the person judging it is me, so I think I don't have the talent. And so it's the same position, it's a postdoc, right? It's the same thing. Now you don't hold the position, you are outside of society, and I can still feel resentment at you because you're not using the great talent that I myself don't have to actually like become the great philosopher that you could be. That seems to be so
That's your paradigm of resentment.
So, well, I think that structure, that emotion
Is
the
it
same emotion
resentment
that
or anger?
I think it's resentment, right? Because the fact that you lack it makes it resentment. So in Aristotle, it is the symmetry of one person has, the other one doesn't.
Mhm.
And then that structures a lot of emotions.
Yeah.
And when you're at the bottom, resentment, I think, always comes from the bottom. And whether indignation tends to come from peers or theoretically from the
Yeah.
top. I just think that you are, by making it the wrong part, the wronging part, I think you're putting too much emphasis on that sometimes tracks with the asymmetry of being at the bottom.
Mhm.
And that's why it's many times is tracking the correct emotion. I just think that the thing that you're correctly tracking is the symmetry. The person resenting is at the bottom,
Mhm.
and that's why they're so easy to wrong. It's not really the wronging doing the work, and that's why I'm trying to remove the wronging, show the symmetry, and look. That's what Aristotle pointed out. Look at the symmetry, and don't deserve good. That's the thing that he points out. Don't deserve good is the thing that is triggering the emotion.
Yeah, so your paradigm case, I've lost track of what the paradigm case is. Is it like the Goodwill Hunting case where the professor is angry at Will?
Yeah, or imagine it's like a postdoc that realizes that they don't have the same ability. And is like, and this Will could have become the distinguished professor at Berkeley, and Will didn't because he's just wasting stuff. I think that's the point. Like, I think resentment, as Aristotle
Yeah.
put it, is unjustified advantage. It's unjustified in this case because they're wasting it. And there's an asymmetry in which you like the thing, but you don't necessarily desire it. If you desire it, it becomes envy on those type of
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah. I'm having trouble keeping it in clear focus, but it might just be
Sorry.
because I'm in the grip of my own picture. I mean, I think when people talk about modern, resentment, there's a really interesting book by, I think Rushdie is his name, about, the different traditions of resentment and modern philosophy. And it tends to get resolved into, the kind of thing that's prominent actually in the moral sense tradition. If you go back to, you start with Butler, it might seem to be the original figure for my kind of moralized aeontic resentment. In some ways, it's very significant in Adam Smith, I think. And it gets, it continues in that tradition to play a significant role. And that tends to get contrasted with something more like the ressentiment you see in the first essay of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, which is less about injury and more about, inequality and lack, being in your alternate position. But that gets more characterized in terms of envy.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and I'm locked into thinking of those as the two main paradigms, and yours is neither of those.
Yes.
Standard, right?
Even-
But it's still the sentiment of the person in the lower position,
Yes.
but it's not about the lack of something that others have in abundance.
Yes.
So what is it about exactly?
So it's about the undeservingness of the person that has it.
But why? I mean, anyone could see that the person who has it is undeserving.
Yes.
And so why is there a special emotion that the person, that the subaltern has that's not accessible to the peer? I'm not quite seeing what that is.
I guess that will be my question. Like,
Yeah.
maybe just my intuitions
Yeah.
are mistaken, but I will
Yeah.
say that, will you claim, imagine you meet another distinguished, I don't know how many.
No, up here.
Let's imagine there's another.
There are
distinguished
many of them, yeah.
I don't know, like there's some universities have like 2 or 3 and they're like in different areas, so you never know.
Yeah,
So.
so many.
I'm not sure
I
that.
don't that many at Stanford, but.
So do you think that your fellow distinguished professor will feel resentment? Do you think that the emotion that they have is,
It depends on what I do to them. If I burn
No,
their
no,
house down, they get
no,
resentment.
I agree
Yeah,
on that,
yeah,
but
okay,
just
yeah.
like, we're saying like, remember, it's just like 2 people are observing the same situation,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
You're just not doing your work, you never did your work, and
Yeah,
you still got it.
yeah.
Okay, and you have great talent, and you're not using it.
Yeah.
One person observing this is the postdoc who doesn't think
Yeah,
deserves it.
yeah.
And then the other one is your peer.
Yeah, yeah.
I think they will have different emotions.
Yeah.
And I think your claim is no, they have the same emotion. So let me ask you, do you think that your peer, only because of that, they look at you and they're like, that shouldn't have happened.
Mhm.
Do you think they're feeling resentment there? I
Well,
think no.
Yeah, I don't know. I
Oh,
mean, I
so
think
close.
there's certainly a place for resentment here, I
Mhm.
mean, I think I could feel pissed off at them in
Yeah.
a certain way.
Definitely.
For squandering this extremely valuable resource
Mhm.
and not doing their part. To contribute to the values that we all, care about and that our community is organized around.
Yeah.
But that's because I'm sorry, I think I'm just in the grip of a picture, but I'm gonna go with it here. But it seems like, when you're in that kind of position, you owe it to the other people who care about this thing to, you owe it to yourself maybe, and so and your parent might, in a different way, even if they don't care about philosophy, might be pissed off at you in that way parents are for are not living up to your own ideals or what the obligations, the duties you owe to yourself. But I'm thinking that the rest of us who care about this value that you're not doing your part to sustain in some ways, could indeed resent you in my terms, because you owe it to us to do your part, and you're letting us down. You're kind of a free rider in some sense, and it's not just that you're a free rider, but you're also blocking this incredibly valuable position that could be made available to someone else who would make much better use of that in the common project that we all care about. So I would see, yeah, that's how I kind of moral in my moral.
Somebody like Juliana, next on the list.
Okay, yeah.
I don't have a puzzle or a difficult case to put to you at all, and I find all of this really interesting. I guess I'm just trying to very selfishly ask you to help me with something I've been struggling with, which is getting my head around the phenomenon of moral panic. And
Okay.
in which you have this kind of sense of an exaggerated threat, moral threat to a community, which so many historical examples, moral panic, and it's a very powerful tool
Yeah,
to justify the marginalization of groups or
Yeah.
their incarceration.
Yeah.
And so to me, in a way, like I really like the idea that reactive blame and anger and resentment can be thought as productive and constructive.
mhm,
But of course, I still worry about the cases in
Yeah.
which it's destructive. And I think that in a way, I like to think of too much anger as being something that facilitates the phenomenon of moral panic.
Yeah.
So I guess I just want you to help me make sense of when reactive blame in the political sphere is most likely to lead to moral panic, and whether it's something you've not really directly thought about, or whether it's something that you found a way to conceptualize. And it's not necessarily, I mean, the difficulty with the concept of moral panic is that it's exaggerated. You postulated that it's an exaggerated threat, when that has to do to some extent with the truth of the claims, and so there is a whole lot of things going on in those cases, but still, I'd love your perspective.
yeah, that's a great issue to think about, and it's a really important one, because I agree that it's a very alarming phenomenon, and that we need to understand it. And I think their general characterization in terms of a sense of exaggerated threat to a viable community seems like it's on target to me. You know, I guess I want to say that, and I haven't thought specifically in these terms about, about the phenomena, but I see a connection to what I was talking about in terms of the politics of grievance, which, is an elaborate story, starting with antagonism. Where the antagonism doesn't necessarily need to be envy. I mean, it's striking how easily it latches onto, non-citizens or migrants or so on, who are in a completely desperate position. There's nothing to be envious about there. It's not like the attitude toward the coastal elites and so on. It's like just hostility to the other and so on. The process I'm describing is one where that gets made sense of by being moralized, right? And so you've got this narrative that characterizes the target of the antagonism as committing grievous wrongs, but a lot of those wrongs are characterized in threat terms, especially if we're thinking of, just take the migrant example. They're coming to subject us to disease and to take away our jobs and destroy our communities and to flood us with jobs, and in some, I'm sure, are good people. I mean, wasn't that the speech kind of basically?
Rapist.
Sorry?
Rapist.
A rapist, yeah, exactly, yeah. And so this is a process. These are grievances. Obviously, someone who's exposing your community to these things is now understood to be wronging you in a way, but the wrong also represents a threat. And as the antagonism is converted into this kind of moralized anger that I mentioned this at one point yesterday, you know, that process actually weirdly intensifies the antagonism that goes along, because the more it makes sense, you know, the more you just kind of inhabit it in a certain sense. And you know, at a certain point, the panic seems to be existential, or the threat seems to be existential, that you've made that you've talked yourself into thinking that the target of your antagonism represents. So I don't know, there's at least one version of the moral panic that is where it's a kind of continuation of the same process I was talking about that involves narratives of grievance. And you know, it's like, it's the grievance, the more existential the grievance has become, the more the party that you're characterizing this term seems like an existential threat. This, you know, this even happens with, you know, it actually, you know, in our political culture, it was quite common even before Trump and the Obama administration for political opponents to characterize Democrats as wanting to destroy America. I mean, even mainstream politicians did that. And you know, that's a narrative of grievance, but it's one that represents the you know, the coastal elite liberals as a real threat to and you know, the American way of life, our democracy and our constitutional order. And you know, and I think panic is a natural reaction to an existential threat in some sense. It's not a health, you know, it's obviously not a healthy process. But it seems continuous with these things I was talking about. I don't know, does that?
Yeah, very much.
Yeah, does that seem, yeah. I mean, I think this is interesting because I think by the time you, and I haven't thought enough about this, but my diagnosis of these larger political processes, you know, it's emphasizing hostility and antagonism. But I haven't really been sure about how to fit this into the picture, but I think there's also a fear element that is part of the story as well, and that's feeding into the processes. But maybe actually connecting the you know, the narratives of grievance with the moral panic, you know, brings fear into it in a natural way. If the you know, the party you oppose, the grievance is really one that represents a continuing threat, it's reasonable to be afraid of an existential threat and so on. And, you know, fear itself, you know, intensifies hostility, defensive violence, and things like this. I mean, by the time we've gotten to this point, it's completely spiraled out of control, of course. And so it's, you know, it needs to be nipped in the bud well before it gets to that point. You know, I don't know how to do that. I mean, I was hopeful that maybe in ordinary interpersonal context, and maybe in some political context, there's a constructive role for this reactive blame to play. But I do think we have to be mindful of the ways it can get hijacked by these processes, and I think that's some of what's going on in our culture. But you know, when it does get hijacked, I mean, it seems to me, if something like this story is right, it's since it's not really about genuine grievances, it's satisfying a psychic need that connects to this negative group, you know, antagonistic group identity formation. We need, you know, somehow that's where the work needs to be done, and you know, but I think it's incredibly difficult to know how we deal with that these days. We've just sorted ourselves into completely different communities that barely interact with each other. No doubt, you know, one weird thing is that these tendencies are, you know, spiraled out of control so much in the current moment. And I'm, you know, you know, I have some kind of pop sociology answers to, you know, the Cold War ended, and so we hate social media. Um, you know, I was at a dinner at Berkeley a couple of weeks ago, and Jared Lanier kind of crashed the dinner, and it's kind of interesting, tech guru, inventor of virtual reality and so on. And, you know, he has really same take on social media, which is that it's a failed experiment. And but it clearly does seem to exacerbate some of these tendencies to, you know, tribalism and, you know, and in ways that we've been talking about, and also to get caught up, as we were also discussing yesterday, in some of the, you know, the pathologies of reactive blame that I was talking about, like you know, moral grandstanding, virtue signaling, and so on. But, you know, I don't know, how do we can hope that social media dies, that might help. Maybe, you know, in the era of remote work, people will become geographically more, I'm grasping at straws here. Maybe, yeah, maybe a war with China. No, I shouldn't be talking about that at all, but it's
Like, Shidelli in that answer, okay, so, your turn.
I'm sorry.
So I think you're right, you're doing something like pop sociology.
Yeah.
And there actually has been an enormous amount of work
Yeah.
done on this by people whose profession is sociology.
Yeah.
And the book actually that I
Yeah.
pointed out to you
Yeah.
synopsizes a great deal of that
Yeah.
work. But my
Could you
question,
remind me the title of that again? You
The
showed.
Truth About Denial,
Oh, right, yeah.
Barden
Yeah.
is the author. And by the way, in the last chapter, he has his own take on Nietzsche's slave revolt, which you will not like. And I doubt he has your grasp of the text, but nevertheless,
Interesting, yeah.
it's interesting in the context of his
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
My question was not about
Yeah.
the sociology. I'd like to see if I can pose a question that will encourage you to elaborate on something that third parties can do more, somewhere between the pathological sorts of
Yeah.
participations that you sketched yesterday, and merely third-party bystanders, you know, vicariously experiencing the resentment of the
Yeah.
Actually offended party.
Yeah.
So let me see if I can construct an example that's a little bit more simple than some of your examples. But
They're very
interesting examples, but let me see if I can suggest an example. Let's suppose, I guess, let's take Joe, who is the villain of Scanlon's story.
Yeah.
So Joe is a manager, and he routinely shames and acts in a disrespectful way towards some underling, Sarah.
Okay.
So he's continually embarrassing Sarah in various ways, and the details are not relevant.
Yeah.
To the example. So I am on a level in an organization, in the organization that is on a parallel with Joe.
Okay.
So I am aware of this. And in fact, I have some, even though Sarah is not my underling, I have some relationship with her. You know, we sometimes eat together in the cafeteria and so
Yeah.
on. And so I have some sort of a collegial friendly
Yeah.
relationship with her. And she confides in me in one of our lunches together that she is really upset about how she's being treated by Joe.
Mhm.
And she says she really feels she can't stand up to him because she's in a relative
Yeah.
position of impotence.
Yeah.
And she does not ask that I stand up for her.
Yeah.
So that's a key part of this story. So she doesn't appoint me as her surrogate
Yeah.
protester.
Yeah.
So I come away from this lunchtime encounter with Sarah, I think about what I ought to do.
Yeah.
One suggestion would be, I have some, the fact that, the mere fact that Sarah has confided in me, the fact that she is quite upset by her treatment by Joe and feels powerless to do anything about it. And the fact that I am not under Joe's thumb.
Yeah.
Makes me, puts me under, at least gives me permission to stand up for Sarah, even though she has not asked me to do it.
Yeah.
So that's one possible view.
Mhm.
There are other views, obviously,
Mhm.
and I don't want to propose.
Yeah.
Which one I would favor, but I'd like to encourage you to elaborate your story about third party. Participants in this sort of interaction in the social dance of accountability that
Yeah.
you have sketched for us in your book and
Yeah,
in other writings.
good. Yeah, no, that's an interesting case, as you were describing it, it almost. I don't know, do you get these at Stanford, these endless trainings about
Yes. State law.
state law? Okay,
State-
yeah, there seems to be a lot of them, but this sounds like a scenario from one of the trainings,
Yes, yeah.
where we are.
Steal it.
No, I'm not
They have
saying.
different ones every time.
Yeah, no, the
That are
names are
similar
changed.
to this,
Yeah,
yeah.
the names are changed.
Yeah.
But we are professors, we're managers, kind of, we're supervisors, I guess what we're called. And so we have reporting, responsibilities, that are understood to devolve to us whenever we get credible evidence of a, violation of expectations in the workplace. And it does sound like Joe has been guilty of such violations in this treatment of Sarah. So, I mean, that's a kind of legalistic way of putting it, but if you are at Joe's level, you're a manager in the firm, you might think, you might actually think you have a special responsibility in virtue of your role for protesting, for protecting the vulnerable members of your community and advocating for them and standing up to the fellow managers when they cross important lines in some way. And that might be a basis. I think that's a basis I could buy into for a special responsibility on your part to intervene in a case like this, even if Sarah doesn't request that you intervene. I mean, one way to put this that actually does go back to one of Armando's questions from day one, is that it's possible that in virtue of being a manager, you have yourself, you stand in a special relationship to your the other managers, and one of the things you kind of owe it to them to help keep them on track in a certain way, in virtue of in virtue of the relation you stand into each other, and that might give you special reasons to protest on Sarah's behalf, as a way of kind of living up to your responsibilities to Joe, to kind of keep him on the right side of the lines, and to make sure he realizes when he's transgressed them. That there's a kind of potential parallel there with when your teenage son has done something wrong to a third party. Your special parental relationship to your son might give you a special reason to vicariously protest on behalf of the victim. So it's not your special relationship to the victim, but your special relationship to the agent. I was thinking something similar might carry over to this kind of case as well. I don't know, does that?
Well, yes, I didn't want to put too much weight into the fact that this was a work organization.
Okay.
So I was,
Right.
while you were answering, emphasizing some of those factors, I was trying to think of maybe Jura's family or my family, where
Yeah.
there's some family member who is routinely embarrassing another,
Okay,
who just
yeah,
is a meek sort of person
Yeah.
who decides, that that it's easier for
good,
him or her to simply try as best they can to not say anything about it
yeah,
and to endure it without a word.
yeah,
But once again, this family member combines that, they are really being hurt by this
Yeah.
kind of
yeah,
behavior.
good,
And I know both of these people, they're
Yeah.
part of my family.
right, okay,
So I know the perpetrator very
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
I certainly am
Right.
sympathize and I'm empathetic
Yeah.
with the victim of this
Yeah.
perpetrator's disregard.
yeah,
So there is not a formal
Right.
organizational.
Right. There's no training that the family has to get through every 6 months.
No, and maybe for the worst, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
Years. Feels like every 6 months,
So I wonder if that,
yeah,
would that sort of resetting
yeah, that's.
of the example change how you respond?
Yeah, I do think it would change, but I still think there are resources that, relational resources one could draw on, because this is now starting to seem like the sort of case where, I was thinking that considerations of solidarity get a nice group,
Mhm.
you've got a vulnerable member of your community,
Mhm.
right, and it's not just a one-off thing. They're, as you described it, they're consistently being subjected to unacceptable treatment. And, they're just constitutionally, retiring and, one thing you could do is try to support them in standing up for themselves within the family, but if they just can't do that for whatever reason, perhaps because of, subconscious legacy and dynamics.
Well,
over the years.
some people are
Yeah.
extremely averse to
Well,
confrontation.
that's right, yeah, so but anyway, I think there, you might owe a duty of solidarity to the vulnerable member of your sub-community or your family, to stand up for them,
So suppose I do that.
Yeah.
And the perpetrator says, well, it's none of your business. So you use that phrase in your
Yeah.
talk yesterday.
Yeah.
So I guess I'd like to understand where, in your view, the line of none of your business is and where it is my business.
yeah, that's a good question, I don't have a theory of that I can just whip out and deploy, but I mean, a natural line is, if a neighbor comes over and starts intervening, maybe that's where none of your business, or maybe not a neighbor, but a stranger sees the interaction in a restaurant and just comes over and starts protesting. But there's but that's
It's a difficult question.
it's a difficult question, but I think it is sort of our business if it's affecting a member of our community. And, this is someone I care about, and I see that they're being significantly mistreated.
Mhm.
And I kind of feel like in that kind of context, I think it might be my business insofar as I stand in the kind of relationship where it might be possible to say that I owe it to them it was Sarah, to her to stand up. Stand up for them, within the family. But it's a good question. Where does it become none of your business? I mean, it's some point, if the infraction becomes egregious enough, I'm happy. I think we have to say it's everyone's business. I mean, if someone's committing a genocide somewhere, I think we all maybe have a duty of solidarity to stand up with the victims in some sense. And, in any way we can and stand by them, not in virtue of any special relationship we have to them, but they're just, vulnerable members of the moral community who are being subjected to an egregious injustice, right? And they're not in a position to stand up for themselves because of their powerlessness. So it would be, obviously the perpetrators might say to us that it's none of your business what we're doing. People, that does actually happen when we think of this case, but that seems like the wrong thing. That's a false thing to say. It is our business given what's happening. So, so at some point, yeah, it becomes everyone's business, but I don't, your case didn't seem to lie, it didn't seem like it was a genocide within the family.
No.
Yeah, yeah. So that's on the other side of the line, but you know, where the line is between these things. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I hope that helps.
Thanks.
So the chair's on the list.
Oh.
And,
Ah.
and I have two questions. So I will defer one to the bottom of the list, since there are other people on the list too. And I will just ask the first one.
Okay.
And it's follow-up to Jorah's line. A thing that came out in the back and forth with Jorah. That where both of you seem to agree is that the whole problem in the grievance cases is that the antagonism has gotten moralized and I guess my question is really about your relationship to Williams and a further part of the Williams critique of the morality system and the blame piece of the morality system in particular. So you focused on a particular aspect of the Williams proleptic interpretation. Where he thinks that it operates through our desire to be respected by people we respect, and that can generate a certain kind of mechanism for the generation of new internal reasons for us. And since you don't need that because you believe in external reasons, so you don't need these new wrong kind of internal reasons. But Williams had other worries about the operation of blame in the morality system, and in the shame and necessity period, he sort of connected this to things that he thought were superior about Greek shame culture to our guilt culture, and that was not unconnected to this idea about social respect. So two advantages that the shame culture was supposed to have over the guilt culture, one on the side of the imagined judge, and one on the side of the wronging agent. The advantage on the side of the imagined judge is that the imagined judge is not the moral law itself or something totally abstract, but is an imagined person whom I respect with a definite social relation to me. And that's and what was so striking to me about it is that the way Williams characterizes what's supposed to be advantageous about that is something you also want for your theory, which is it's supposed the fact that this respected agent has a definite social relation to me is what is supposed to lay out for me the pathway toward repair of my relationships with the social group. And that's the same sort of positive use of blame for repair that you want to generate. Then there's supposed to be an advantage on the side of the targeted agent who did the wrong thing, which is that the source of the wrong need not be located in something that is purely up to me. And therefore is totally enmeshed in my psychological and social and cultural set of motivations and exactly the sorts of things that might, in the context of pure blame, start to look like excusing conditions. And because it's totally enmeshed in those things, it's supposed to be clear to me what's at stake for the reconstruction of my moral psychology, and therefore what I need to do in order to create repair. And I guess I'm still with Jorah a little bit worried that if we rely on the blame system as the morality system understands it. To be in charge of this work of repair
Mhm.
that are focused on a source and the agent that is suitable as a target for blame, the cause completely up to me. And purified in that sense, and our sense of the rule as something that is abstract and externally binding.
Mm.
Both actually conduce to the development of non-repair oriented, free-floating, ever-expanding grievance system-like escalations of the blame system. And I'm going to try to give an example.
Good.
That I'm going to try to give an example without violating anything.
Okay. This is good.
But as
spicy.
as you know, I spent the last 5 years in a place where a lot of personal conflict came to my attention. And over and over again, I saw the following kind of pattern. There's some decision that has to be taken. People don't agree about the decision. The life prospects of some member of their community affected by the decision in pretty decisive ways. Once the decision is made, there's nothing to be done about it. The loss has happened.
Yeah.
And in the aftermath of this, there's ongoing conflict among the colleagues who participated in the decision. And we're on different sides of the concrete question between them. And it actually does seem to me that those situations are dramatically damaged by the tendency of the participants to systematize and moralize the nature of the conflict between them. And the more they systematize it and the more they moralize it, the harder it is to repair.
Yeah.
So the Williams style critique, and that's what I wanted to
Yeah.
get your answer to is, okay, yeah, you could use blame in the way you're talking about to devise a constructive pattern toward repair, but actually it's a super extra dangerous tool for doing that. And if we reconfigured the core concepts that we use in our accountability dynamics with each other, we would have a better chance of avoiding not only grievance politics in the large, but also runaway escalation of moralized interpersonal conflict in smaller groups.
Right. Wow, there's a lot in that. I think that was a beautiful, sympathetic articulation of a really important strand in the larger trajectory of Williams's work on blame and responsibility. You're right, I was really focusing on, the material about proleptic blame, but I think his probably most significant contribution on these topics is shame and necessity, and I totally agree with your reading. I mean, I don't entirely understand the argument of the book, but I think you've hit very nicely on a large theme that I think he's really concerned about in the book. I mean, he's not, as I read him, he's not so much arguing that we should give up guilt in favor of shame, but go back to a set of accountability relations and a framework for relating to people where the shame guilt distinction is not salient in the way it seems to look from the perspective of someone like me who's kind of in favor of the deontic morality system organized around this kind of special case of resentment that
You purify or guilt
de-purify it.
in the direction of shame without going all the way back there, or
exactly.
something like that.
That does seem to be what he's pointing towards. Yeah, and so I'm actually sympathetic to the idea that it is a hazard. In some sense, this is continuous with what I was trying to say yesterday. It's a hazard of the more, deontic, guilty, resentmenty way of relating to people that, which I'm characterizing as kind of morality system and accountability relations that it does have potential for escalation in really hazardous ways. And I think you're gesturing toward a context where I think that I mean, not the one I was talking about, I was talking about more political context where these motions get kind of hijacked into moralized ways of interpreting each other in a broader social context that just exacerbate conflict and preclude repair as opposed to, pointing the way towards it. And yeah, I think when I think it's if difficult collective decisions that people need to make get moralized in the same way when they belong when they're members of a similar community. I could see similar processes getting a foothold in a way that would not be at all constructive. Yeah, in some ways that's grist from my mill. The question is really whether what the remedy is. My remedy is like vigilance, managerial vigilance in our participation in the system of accountability relations. And I kind of in the discussion yesterday, I expressed the slight worry that this is going to leave me at a position not that distant from Martha Nussbaum at the end of the day, because there might, it might turn out that there's so many hazards here that we don't, once we've domesticated our anger into something that's potentially constructive, it's dissipated into something that's not a particularly significant thing. Now, I think you're right. Williams is pointing in a different direction, not just staying within this, this kind of deontically structured set of accountability relations, but moving into a different space in moral psychology. And I think that's an intriguing possibility, but I've never entirely gotten clear about how we're supposed to do that exactly. I mean, I guess, reading a lot of ancient tragedies was to help, I guess. And maybe it does. I guess I'm open to that. There might be, and this does seem like this is helpful because I think your way of putting this helps me to understand better. I think also part of what Joel was getting at earlier. Yeah. And yeah, I don't want to preclude that as a different way of responding to these hazards, just moving into a different space altogether of accountability relations. But I, as someone who thinks that there are this core set of, obligations that we owe to each other in virtue of, being equal persons whose interests are vulnerable to the effects of each other's agency. I think there are these deontic things out there, and lack of consideration for them does, impair our relations to each other and call for some kind of response. Right? Yeah, so I'd want to preserve, however far we move in a Williams direction towards reconfiguring our accountability relations to make them a little more amorphous and less blaming and more shamey. Where it would be a bridge too far if we would give up the idea that there are things that we owe to each other. Just I think for Williams that wouldn't be a bridge too far. So I think he's skeptical about that. So that's going to be one place where I'll put my foot down and not want to move in the entirely into Williams' direction. Maybe just two further points. So this is really
That was very clarifying. That
Yeah.
was,
okay.
but go ahead.
Yeah.
2 more points.
I mean, these are just kind of smaller points about Williams. You know, there is something I think cool about this desire to be respected by people you respect. And I think it came up in discussion yesterday at the end, or maybe it was after the talk history. I can't really remember when this intervention occurred, but someone brought to my attention, you know, the situation where, you know, the agent of wrongful conduct, you know, doesn't really respect the victim, and so is not prone to respond constructively to the victim's protest, but does respect the third party. And, you know, that's another kind of interesting kind of relational feature about where you would stand in social space that I would be happy to say would maybe call on you to mobilize the respect that the wrongdoer holds you in on behalf of the victim in some ways. And that would be kind of deploying the Williams style mechanism in a way. The other comment about Williams, and I'm just curious about this goes back to the proleptic blame part of it. But, you know, I think I gave an accurate to that paper representation of how proleptic blame is supposed to work. When you blame someone, your blame carries the false presupposition that they had reason to comply with the moral norm that you're blaming them for violating, right? And the blame has the interesting feature in virtue of this background desire to be respected by people who respect that it gives them reason. It makes true the false presupposition that it started from, which is kind of interesting process. But my hang up about that, as I've been thinking about it just recently, is that I'm not sure that that's the right story, even on Williams's account, because if the desire to be respected by people you respect is already there as part of the motivational set of the agent from the beginning, then it looks like there was an internal reason all along for them not to violate the norm. And then blame doesn't create the reason, it just epistemically reminds the person of the reason that was there all along. But that doesn't look like the
Yeah.
proleptic story any
Right,
longer.
but there might be kinds of cases where the proleptic story is really true,
Yeah,
where. But maybe it turns out, that's an interesting point, and maybe it turns out that true proleptic story is less broad than makes it seem in the paper. But if you imagine a case where.
Yeah.
What has happened, where the wrongfulness really does depend on something like thoughtlessness of the agent.
Yeah.
So they didn't notice that they had this.
Yeah.
They forgot something
Mhm.
that they should have been expected to remember, even if they're generally a forgetful person. This is something they should have remembered.
Yeah.
You know, it's not that they had a reason.
Mhm.
They didn't exactly have a reason because they had totally forgotten it, and it wasn't in their horizon of reason. So they didn't have an internal reason at the time when they made the decision, and that's exactly the problem.
Yeah.
And the blaming person is trying to change their psychic accounting by getting them to see.
Right. I mean, part of the problem here is just knowing how to interpret the internal reasons theory.
Well,
But if some cases are, and I'm not an expert, I don't really know. But, you know, some cases of forgetting are cases where there is a connection between doing something and your things you already care about, but you've forgotten some fact that is important to keep in focus to see what the connection is, right? And in those cases, I think, you know, remembering or reasoning your way to rediscovering that fact, you know, could be part of a process of deliberating from your motivational set to a motivation that you didn't already have, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, so I, you know, but there might be a case where blaming someone, if they didn't have a well articulated desire at all to be respected by people they respect. But once someone, you know, it's a question of what a desire is, but you know, that desire comes into focus for them for the first time.
once they get this.
Yeah.
So then, can I just ask a quick follow-up? Sure, very good. So,
Yes.
so it would be genuinely proleptic in the case where there's something like a genuine exercise of discretion on the part of the person who I respect to choose whether or not to engage in
Yeah.
blaming and dishonesty, right?
Good.
Because that's not derived.
Yeah, good.
So,
Yeah.
so
Good.
until Lanier decides whether
Yeah.
or not to
Great.
blame me for the thing.
Yeah.
It wasn't
Yeah.
true that I had the reason. to
Good.
blame me.
Yeah.
Now. It
Right.
becomes true.
Yeah, right. That's helpful. Yeah, maybe that's part of the Williams story. Probably is, actually. I don't think he's not gonna be very moralizing about. Yeah. Right, you know, blame.
Yeah.
It's like, so it's not like
Yeah.
there's an obligation, it is kind of just discretionary. Yeah,
right.
that's great. That's helpful.
Josh.
So I want to ask about a kind of interpersonal case, and then depending on what you say, see if that tells us anything about the political case. So the kind of interpersonal case I'm thinking of, I think is a fairly common occurrence in long-term romantic partnerships, or anyone who grew up with siblings is probably familiar with this. But sometimes someone just does something that makes you angry, right? And objectively, it's not a big deal.
Yeah.
But it's just something that just makes you angry. My worry, well, I mean, maybe this isn't a worry, but I wonder if you can make sense of that, because in a sense, it seems like, right, the anger requires some wronging, then it's like problematically self-referential here, right? Like the only reason that thing is wrong is because it makes me angry.
Yeah.
But so it can't be making me angry because it's wrong. So, right, you could say, well, that's just always irrational. Or, you know, that's always pathological or something like that, but I don't know, I mean, it seems like a fairly, you know, familiar phenomenon. I guess you could also say that, like, it's mediated by some initial, like, feeling of irritation or something like that.
Mhm.
But I don't know that that is sort of the correct account of the phenomenology, right? Sometimes it's just, no, that makes me angry, why are you doing it? Right? And so I wonder what you would make of that kind of case on your theory here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good, good kind of case to think about. Yeah, I am thinking that, well, I think this is Aristotle in rhetoric, isn't it? Yeah, that anger, well articulated anger is about a slight or something, you know, it's got a target and an occasion in some sense. That seems like the kind of structure of anger, and but you know, the interesting thing, and I think your examples are in this ballpark, is that it does seem like cases where there's something anger-like or rage-like, which is more amorphous, you know. And how do you, so what's going on in those cases? Because there, you know, it doesn't seem to be about anything. And anger does seem to be about a slight or something.
Well, I'm thinking like, it's like, you know, someone leaves their dirty dishes in the sink. or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
Right, and it just makes you angry, right? Like, you could have agreed to. You know, so there is an occasion, right? The dirty dishes in the sink. It's not like free floating anger.
Right. Okay.
But it's like, it's more like, well, why is that bad?
Yeah.
Right. Maybe the dirty dishes isn't a good example. Maybe.
Chewing on ice.
Chewing on ice. Chewing on ice.
But it isn't a key question in your example, whether or not there had been a prior agreement not to leave dirty dishes in the sink and a promise not to do so. So that, I think that's.
I don't know. So maybe that is pushing my intuitions around in this case. I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know, but certainly there seem to be cases where you're like, yes, you know, you can chew on ice. Obviously, you can chew on ice, right? I'm not gonna, you know, take that away from you. But then you do it, and I'm like, stop.
But a lot of cases like that, people don't, you can't stand the noise. Your sibling knows that you can't stand the noise, and they're doing it once again. That's a lack of consideration, regard. I mean, the striking thing is that it blows up, it's out of proportion. And a lot of those cases, and that might be similar with the dishes, you know, it's, once again, you know, I come home and they eat these dishes. They know that, you know, this isn't doing their fair share, and, you know, they know I'm tired at the end of the day. I don't like doing the dishes for someone else when I come home. And, you know, it's a minor thing in itself, but it's So kind of lack of consideration, especially when it's part of a larger pattern that can often easily erupt into some, something that seems out of proportion to the occasion. But there's still, there's still an immediate occasion, and especially if it's part of a pattern, I think that might be significant to the way you're responding to it. That being said, I think a lot of these cases are disproportional and somewhat pathological. And there are also cases, interestingly, where the immediate occasion, it's really about something else. You had a bad day at work or something like that, and your paper got rejected or whatever after the 3-year revising your submission ordeal.
Hypothetically.
Just to take a random hypothetical, well, it couldn't happen to anyone here. And the comments are idiotic, and so you come home and you fly off the handle about the dishes. Yeah, that's certainly a phenomenon, isn't it? Yeah. But I mean, I think in that case, I'd want to say it's really about something else and you're taking it out.
Yeah, I guess, where I was going with this is, if you think there's something there where like,
Yeah.
you can just be kind of like, stop that because it's making me angry. Then in the political case, you might think, well, shouldn't there be like claims of the form of, well, don't do that, right? Stop, sipping
Yeah.
lattes and driving in limousines or whatever it is, or driving in Priuses, because it bothers us, and it bothers us, right? Could there be political claims?
Yeah.
I mean, I share Jorah's idea that those don't seem reasonable, but if we're trying to understand the kind of political
Yeah.
case on the model of the interpersonal case.
Yeah.
I wonder, could those be legitimate?
Yeah. Doesn't seem very legitimate to me. Yeah. But I guess when I come back to the interpersonal case, and we've got the ice chewing example, it seems like that the root kind of thing is, and this is salient in family context, of course, but you hate the noise of someone chewing ice, right? That's the root thing, and the other person knows you hate the noise, and once again they're chewing ice, and but then it's not like the anger is the original thing. It's a response to this prior kind of root thing that might structure reasonable expectations among these people, or at least give a pretext for the anger. I mean, there's another phenomenon in the ballpark, maybe frustration. Because I think you can get frustrated. You're doing something and you just get consistently stymied in it, either by the nature of the task or by your own ineffectiveness or something. People often fly off in a rage at the end of that, and that is not really. There's no real. In my earlier case, it was like you've been wronged by the journal, which has not seen the quality of your arguments after the 3-year process, and the reviewer, is being a dick about it.
You're scaring younger scholars.
I think you should just view it as an impersonal process like the rain. And and try to kind of demoralize it. Yeah. Probably.
Unless you have good reason to think that they were chewing ice.
Well, that would be different, yeah.
It's your turn to chew ice.
Okay,
I can add you to the bottom of the list, and I'll do my best.
I'll try to be quick. This is a follow-up to Juliana's question about moral panic. So I'm kind of struck by the Trump case for reasons other than the ways I was originally struck by it. So this seems to be a case where they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're stealing our jobs. So I take like what to be very important about that case is they're stealing our jobs. So you sort of generate this like faux sense that there's something that they have which we do not. Or what we do have is in jeopardy or something like that. And so I guess I'm wondering the sort of resulting attitude that we get out of that, or that not we, but like the people who are convinced by this rhetoric and they think, yeah, they're taking our jobs. Is that resentment or is it something like resentment? And I mean, on the one hand, I don't want to say like, well, like this is a deliberate case of social engineering and there are people in rooms and they're planning these things. But on the other hand, I mean, maybe, Trump had Bannon, I mean, and they don't have to be sort of thinking in terms of resentment and like, what's the philosophical kind of resentment and how do we generate that? But how do you get people to react in a certain way? How do you get them to think that there's something that they're taking that you have that's in jeopardy and so I guess I'm wondering what you think about this, how it relates to your kind of view on resentment.
Good.
And then maybe just moral panic in general and the generation of attitudes that motivate people towards action.
Great. I think what's going on is, the populist demagogues are the kind of new Nietzschean priestly aristocracy, and they are kind of strategic about what they're doing. And there's a certain genius that Trump has at explaining people's life circumstances to them in ways that make emotional sense. And I'm struck that that involves telling them why, there are people doing these, these bad things to them or looking down. A lot of it is about disrespecting them and looking down their nose at them. A peculiar genius in Trump's case is, it's the fact that the elite really do hold him in contempt. I mean, he's a figure of ridicule in our circles, honestly. And I think that a weird thing is that gets transformed into contempt for the masses or for his audience via their identification with him. And he's great at exploiting that process. I mean, so he takes something genuine, contempt in which people will hold him, and that becomes at his rallies. This is one of the things that Mark Danner describes. And he went to a bunch of Trump rallies. I had several conversations with him. It was kind of scary process for him, but he thought it was mesmerizing to see how effectively he was through a kind of transference process, getting contempt or disrespect for him, or the Justice Department going after him is really kind of an attack on them through a kind of imagined identification with him. It's great how he foments that identification by eating the food Hillary Clinton wouldn't touch Kentucky Fried Chicken with a barge pole, and he's eating it on his private jet. It's like I'm one of you in a weird way. Anyway, I think he's got to just. It may not be that strategic, and he's got just a kind of good instinct for how to get people riled up in these ways. And I think that is just the process of feeding them narratives that are moralized, that he knows they're going to kind of be susceptible to and latch onto. He's got a real feel for that. The specific stealing our jobs thing, I think you're right. That's part of it, and that's a moment where the kind of grievance narrative, potentially generates the moral panic because the grievance turns into a continuing threat, and it's a threat that is going to be particularly acutely felt by people, who are already vulnerable. They are objectively vulnerable. They're kind of, they live in a deindustrializing part of the world where there aren't great prospects for people without college educations and things like that. Those are genuine features of their situation, and to feel like their jobs and their livelihood and their way of life are under threat is, converts the grievance into something that that taps into fear reactions and kind of escalates it into a kind of moral panic situation of the kind that Juliana was describing. I'm struck that the language here, though, is they're not just taking our jobs, they're stealing our jobs.
Right.
That's important to it, because stealing is, you've got an entitlement to something and they're taking something that you're entitled to. That's important that it's, and that's the grievance narrative, right? It was a triumph amongst these demagogues to describe economic migrants and political refugees as illegal, immigrants, right? Because we're already describing them right from the start as, violating the rules. It's like we played by the rules and they didn't play by the rules. Not really naturally feeds into the kinds of narratives that like Arlie Hochschild describes, where these other people are cutting ahead of them in the line and so on. But that's all the stuff that I was trying to talk about. And these are just different aspects of the narratives of grievance. But I think one thing I was not downplaying was the way that some of the narratives connect to kind of representation of the targeted antagonism as an ongoing threat to something that you really value, or that's important to your identity. And that at that point you do get this kind of existential dimension to it that turns it into a more. So I don't know. Is that,
Yeah.
Ally.
I'm curious how your descriptive normative project, I'm curious about the relationship with that. With making people better.
yeah, I don't know how to make people better. I'm just a moral philosopher. But, yeah, sorry. It's, no, I mean, that sounds flippant, but
Along the lines of the account.
yeah, I guess, I mean, the less open, I mean, I think what the philosopher can maybe contribute are, is an interpretation like of our moral relations to each other and how they connect to some of our moral emotions that can help people to make sense of things that are going on, right? And I think there is a contribution that insofar as like understanding your predicament might be a first step on the way to dealing realistically with the situation and to improving the way you relate to other people. I think it's important to see what the pathologies are. For instance, what kinds, right. What are some of the pathological forms of blame? Just to go back to what I was talking about yesterday, and how do they connect to the nature of the norms that structure our relations, and to a kind of healthy form of accountability interactions. I think understanding the pathologies and trying to get a grip on them, is like a propedeutic to using our managerial capacities to try to avoid slipping into the pathologies ourselves. Where I'm less, if we're talking about like, the politics of resentment and the propensity of people to latch on to narratives of grievance that make sense of their antagonism, I think there's a real role for managerial agency there. And, if any of you still have, social media accounts and haven't deleted them as you should do ASAP. But, I mean, when you see a tweet that gets you all riled up about something, you should probably like just not pay attention. It's probably, it's just a tweet, and it's, but that would be like, I think this is sounding very banal, but the one way of exercising you're aware of your own tendency to get exercised. I mean, if you ever have contributed money to a politician on Act Blue, the email account that's linked to that contribution, you just get bombarded with kind of angry, it's like all capital. DeSantis did this, we should be $5 immediately. And, anyway, it's just kind of manufacturing grievance and in a way that taps into your antagonism. But understanding that there's that propensity maybe could help you kind of resist in a way. And that's a toy example maybe of the way the processes of understanding how our normative relations and accountability practices can be deformed, might lead you to be a better moral agent yourself. I'm not optimistic, no one's gonna read. I mean, it's like 27 philosophers at most, most of them my students would read anything I've published on this topic, so it's not gonna help.
I was gonna deny it and say, I read it, Jay, and then I remembered I'm.
No.
Yeah.
We're at time. With apologies to those who are still on the list. I think we should thank our speaker, and those still on the list, please feel free to come up and ask.
Thank you so much. That was really stimulating discussion. I learned a lot. Yeah,
Me too.
yeah. It was fun. The recording stopped itself.
So I did.
Another question.
I know, but I assume they're gonna be continuing interacting.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're taking to the dinner. It's good to see you.
Oh, okay, yeah.